side effects may include fill in the blanks. And I believe I mentioned on another show, it was probably the vaccines are poison episode 8, that I believe I mentioned about antidepressants, how on certain the pamphlets for certain antidepressants, it says in the bottom in fine print, thought to help with depression. You can think all you want. I could think that eating gummy bears could help to get rid of AIDS, but that doesn't mean that I should patent gummy bears and, into a vitamin and make a pamphlet and, but I could, so I could make this pamphlet and I could write in the bottom, thought to cure AIDS. And it's just gummy bears. So this is my point. Gummy bears obviously don't cure anything, and probably, especially if you eat them in large amounts, are going to cause a problem. You're going to have a bad time. So anyway, this is an interesting point. Fiorello LaGuardia, and he was, I don't know the years, but he was at one point the mayor of New York City. Fiorello LaGuardia was a strong opponent to the Marijuana Tax Act. And the Marijuana Tax Act happened, I believe, in 1938 or 1942, or like right in between there. So he conducted an in-depth study, the LaGuardia Committee. The U.S. Treasury Department was claiming marijuana made people insane, deteriorated physical and mental health, assisted in criminal behavior and juvenile delinquency, was physically addictive, and served as a gateway to drugs more dangerous. The conclusion to the LaGuardia Committee was that the practice of smoking marijuana does not lead to addiction. It does not lead to morphine/heroin/cocaine addiction. Marijuana is not the determining factor in the commission of major crimes, and juvenile delinquency is not associated with the practice of smoking marijuana. And if you've hung out with anybody who has smoked marijuana while you've been sober, so you're seeing it with sober eyes kind of thing, these guys aren't all like, let's go outside and vandalize shit. These guys are like, let's sit here and watch Family Guy and laugh. You know what I mean? And which I personally think is a beautiful thing, because laughter, as you can tell, I laugh all the friggin' time. Laughter is another incredible medicine, and how great do you feel? If I've talked about The Secret before, there was one particular person in The Secret, using laughter as a medicine, as an example. There was one particular person in The Secret who was dealing with cancer. And her doctor, of course, decided he was God and said, you have 6 months to live, or whatever, some other bullshit thing. And she said, yeah, I don't accept that. Good for her. And decided, you know what? I'm going to laugh a lot. So she watched a lot of movies and she laughed her ass off and the cancer disappeared. Now, laughter really is one of the greatest medicines that we have, and cannabis is another one. So let's continue. Fiorello LaGuardia recognized that the people, the Main Street populace, did not view cannabis negatively, and they weren't interested in the enforcement of the Marijuana Tax Act, considering how many partook in taking marijuana in any form. It was only when, Nixon came into quote unquote power, considering he's a puppet for a higher global elite. It was only when he came into power that, he started this whole garbage of the war on drugs and everything. Just ridiculous. Every 10 or so years, 1999 being the most recent, the U.S. government, the Institute of Medicine, sponsors a study that looks into the possibility of marijuana being useful as a medicine. And every 10 years, these bodies come out with the same conclusion, that there's medicinal value to marijuana, and the statements of it having horrendous effects, being a gateway drug, being addictive, are just dramatic and ridiculous. But the government won't legalize and decriminalize, of course, because let's look at that before I continue with this list. Why won't the government legalize or decriminalize? The real problem is that we want it out of the legal books, because there's no point to having it in the legal books. I mean, Twizzlers aren't in the legal books, right? If you walk down the street eating a Twizzler, you're not going to get arrested. and take it to a private prison where some industry or some, the dude who owns the private prison ends up making like 2,000 a head or something like that. Like that's not happening, even though that's happening with our brothers and sisters here on earth who are carrying cannabis and are not doing anything to hurt anybody. And they're being shoved in these private prisons just because every head that enters the private prison makes whoever owns the prison money. Now, that's when you know your world is a tiny bit backwards, because not only have we profited off the raping of our forest and the cutting down of our trees and the polluting of our sky and our oceans and our land. I mean, how much soil is actually left? How much topsoil is actually not contaminated? That's the real question. Those are indications that we're living in definitely on a level 1 or level 0, a very infantile planet, very early in our spiritual evolution, of course. But the fact that some dude who has a couple of marijuana plants, gets busted and goes to a private prison, murderers might get 2 years, but someone who sells cannabis might get 10, might get 20. That's completely backwards, don't you think? Don't you think so? Don't you think that people who are smoking or eating or vaporizing a beautiful herb that heals everything under the sun, like, does that make sense to you? These people going to, whatever. You understand. But let's get into what I was going to say. I kind of sidetracked myself, sorry. But the government won't legalize / decriminalize, of course. The reason being, this is something that heals pretty much everything. Absolutely everything. So what's going to happen to Big Pharma? How do you patent a plant? That's the reality. They've done it. They've done it to an extent. They've taken marijuana, they've turned it into a pill, and I can't remember the name of it right off, but they mention it in medicinal cannabis and its impact on human health. They mention it in that film that a certain pill was made from marijuana, but it was changed enough that it wasn't the plant. Because that's part of it. You can't patent a plant. I can't just go outside and pick a bunch of dandelions and say, okay, I patent dandelions now. They're mine. And I'm going to sell them. Granted, I could sell dandelions, but I can't patent dandelions, in any way, shape, or form. So this is what's happening. Big Pharma is going to lose out on so much money because people will wake up to the reality. What also happens, and this is funny because they actually outlined this in Pineapple Express, if you ever saw that movie, and I just saw it a couple nights ago. At the beginning, they're showing down in an underground bunker, in a deep underground military base, a DUMB, very aptly named, by the way. Dumb. They show this soldier being tested upon with marijuana. He's literally just smoking marijuana for like days and days and days straight. And when they ask him what he thinks about his I don't know what you call it, his leading officer, like the officer who gives him orders, immediately he's thinking, and he is challenging the system. And this is one reason they don't want people to touch cannabis, because it is mind altering to the point that it expands the mind. It opens the mind. If you were not someone who was on the precipice of a mega awakening, I can assure you that if you start to deal in the world of cannabis, if you start to be a part of that, new questions will arise for you, because I've definitely seen it makes people, and I'm personally, me, myself, anyway, I am curious to begin with, and I think curiosity is one of the greatest things we have. And to not ask questions, I think, is a great fault. I think is a great mistake that so many of us fall into. Not really me. That sounds really egotistical, but it's not supposed to, because I've always been very much like that, asking questions. But when it does come to the cannabis issue, I didn't ask questions for almost 30 years of my life. And it was only through the experiences that I told you about earlier that I really started to chip away at that wall, but they talk about that in Pineapple Express. It is really fascinating, that whole opening scene is all about how this guy, his mind has opened up, and now he doesn't agree with his commanding officers. He doesn't agree with just taking orders. And immediately, of course, the commanding officer said, "Shut it down. It's now going to be illegal." And it's very dramatic, but that's virtually what happened, because people, when they are smoking cannabis, eating cannabis, vaporizing cannabis, they start to ask questions. They start to talk. There starts to be conversation. And that is something that we've been so distracted for so long from doing. That is one reason that I decided to do Earth Created, because not enough people are talking. And in my own personal life, I have a few people I can talk to, but sometimes I really want to talk about this stuff with people that haven't heard it. And that's harder for me to find. So doing an online show like this, hopefully is helping to broaden certain perspectives and certain people to what's actually happening and what's been happening and what's going on. And the other thing is that, like we were saying, Big Pharma would totally go out of business if people realize that cannabis is not horrendous for you, is one of the greatest things for you, and will really make a difference. I know in my own personal experience, I am what society considers overweight. So I have very big boobs. So what happens with this is, and I'm not a physical person. So if I stand for 5-10 minutes, my lower back, my tailbone starts to kill, and it hurts so bad. Unless you have this problem, you have no idea. So when I have that happen, if I'm not going anywhere that day or whatever else, I'll eat a cookie. And within 10 minutes, the cannabis goes immediately to that place that is hurting. And that's the other thing about cannabis. It very much is a goddess plant. It is very intuitive. It has that feminine energy. It is incredibly intuitive, incredibly feeling, very much connected to the realm of emotion. And it goes immediately to the place that is not having its greatest time, so that is really, 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 really wonderful that we have something like that. But what isn't wonderful is that this thing is criminalized. And if you walk down the street with a couple of joints in your pockets, you are considered a criminal. And, for all those listening to this show, if you want a really interesting piece of, an interesting anecdote, there's some kind of handbook, I couldn't tell you the name of it, that psychiatrists use that list like all the problems that people go through, emotional and mental problems that people go through, and how to diagnose them, and how to find them, within conversation with somebody during a session. In those books now, apparently, just in the last year, they have added a few more things. One of those things is problems with authority. I have great problems with authority. So apparently now I am deemed crazy because I don't agree with the government or the religions or the de-education system or the medical institution. I don't agree with any of this in our societal propriety society. And, now that deems me as being crazy. That deems me as a terrorist. That deems me as, that's ridiculous. So I just want to put that anecdote out there because someone who's walking down the street with a couple of joints is now deemed a criminal. And if you question authority, you're considered a terrorist. You're considered crazy. Think about that for a second. Let's just take a minute. So that's ridiculous. In 1974, this man named Robert Randall was arrested because he was smoking marijuana, and I'm not 100% if he was growing it. More than likely he was. But he had glaucoma, and the marijuana was diminishing his glaucoma to the point where he was like becoming blind, right? And marijuana was helping to alleviate that problem. He founded the Alliance for Cannabis Therapeutics, also known as Act, ACT, an organization that supports the use of medical marijuana. He was the first person to successfully use medical marijuana as a defense against charge of marijuana. Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. He was the first person to successfully use medical marijuana necessity as a defense against a charge of marijuana.